as this session called the Values Crossroads, and basically know that it's not uncommon for student unions to talk about values, many lists of values associated with their strategic plan, but many student unions don't necessarily act to enforce certain values in their members. What I do in this session is I'm going to look at some challenges that the trade union movement and the international development sector have faced in terms of membership engagement, and I look at those challenges through the kind of lens of psychological understandings of values and how values work, and I'm going to use that to illustrate how students' unions can work to certain types of values in their membership, which are associated with some of the behaviours we're trying to reach, like voting or volunteering or participation in societies or whatever. I use this to sort of illustrate a fairly fundamental decision that students' unions need to make as they stand at this sort of values crossroads. So first off, we're going to look at the development sector. Believe it or not, we're going to look at what we can learn from Oxfam. So, in 2011, Martin Kirk and Andrew Darnton, who are from Oxfam and a group called Bond, published a paper that was pretty seminal called Finding Frames Needs to Engage the UK Public in Global Poverty. The basic argument was this. So they're saying that data suggests that increasing incomes, i.e. getting more money in for the charity, have been by changing the nature of engagement, by turning members into supporters and setting them at arm's length. Right. So this was the idea that sort of non-governmental organisations and charities created a kind of checkbook relationship between members and poverty. So in order to raise more money, Oxfam and other organisations demand to, for example, make poverty history into a transaction. So the idea is like, you give money and we end poverty. And ultimately, this is a very disempowering relationship, as the public role in the fight for global justice is then limited to a set of ethical consumptions, as illustrated by this advert. So you sort of buy a white wristband to end poverty, or you get a charity credit card, or you buy one of these products. This is a Gap. This is. So, and basically buy these products, and they'll give us sort of small financial donation to a cause in inverted commas. Meanwhile, the protesting is done by professionals, basically, from these kind of protest businesses, as they position themselves, who are privileged elite who you can trust to change the world as long as you donate sort of £5 a month. So the relationship that this sets up between the organisation and the members is of the kind of powerful giver to the grateful receiver. So it disempowers those that it intends to reach and reinforces a kind of model of charity at arm's length rather than social justice. Kirk and Darnton described how technological developments develop a kind of model publication called cheap participation, characterised by low barriers to entry, engagement and exit, all of which generate high churn. So kind of a mile and an inch deep approach to membership engagement, whereby sort of smart or KPI obsessed cultures focus these organisations' efforts on the breadth rather than depth of membership engagement. So a world where clicktivism replaces activism and political engagement is measured in likes, follows and retweets. In short, what Kirk and Darnton found in the development sector was they identified a shift towards treating members as consumers, an unhelpful focus on outputs over outcomes, and linking the politics to a small elite group, and wider membership engagement to a sort of arm's length online exchanges, which, I don't know about you, but I sort of immediately think of unions for some reason. Problem this sector is now wrestling with are multiple, and what sector I mean, the development sector. So themselves as active global justice enthusiasts dropped during the campaign from 1% to 40%, while global poverty skeptics increase. So for many NGOs, the use of celebrities, pop concerts, and images of starving children to safeguard donations remains the norm, which sort of, so it's images like this, which I'm sure you've seen, which further the darkening shadow of Live Aid, within which poverty is framed as a kind of natural phenomenon, because on the other side of the world, and that the solution to it is a kind of sympathetic charity, rather than understanding, Nelson points out here that poverty is a man-made phenomenon and occurs everywhere, to which the solution is a struggle for global justice and solidarity. So the biggest problem for NGOs really is poverty is political. Therefore, to successfully end poverty, they need their members to act politically together. So what now is to look at how Kirk Barton's report uses psychological research to explain the fact that actually the way that a lot of these charities like Oxfam were going about relating to them was we're actually encouraging the exact opposite sorts of behaviour. Okay, so why do values matter? Well, values was kind of guiding principles for our lives, and although we're rarely conscious of it, they underpin our attitudes and our behaviour. So this diagram is a little crass. Obviously not as straightforward as that, but the vast body of psychological research evidencing values influence how we treat each other, how we treat the environment, our well-being, our life choices, and our politics. Barton used Schwartz's values wheel, which you can see here, explain how values work and how their campaigns affect people's values. So Schwartz's research identified 57 values, which he mapped across the 10 groups, which you can see on this values wheel here. So they're self-direction, universalism, benevolence, confirming tradition, security, power, achievement, hedonism, and stimulation. Right. You don't need to understand all that, but ultimately, as this diagram shows, some of the values associated with what referred to as intrinsic goals, and some are associated with extrinsic goals. Intrinsic values focus on compassion and autonomy, so they're values which are generally more inherently rewarding to pursue. So, if someone has strong intrinsic values, such as equality or unity, which is that universalism, which is the green one at the top, more likely to volunteer, for example, local to work, and then equally, as research has shown that extrinsic values, on the other hand, like competition or power, are on external approval or reward. Someone with strong extrinsic values, such as like power or achievement, which you can see in purple and red at the bottom, values like that is more likely to act honestly. For example, put this in a familiar context, NUS ran a project at King's College London Students' Union, and we measured all the students' values and also their behaviour, and we found that students who had stronger intrinsic values were more likely to believe that the Students' Union should campaign for change than those with strong extrinsic values. So students with stronger intrinsic values were more likely to have taken part in a campaign. And here's a graph that shows that basically the higher students' values, which again is in intrinsic values, the more likely they thought that that unions should do volunteering and fundraising. It matter because they affect how the choices we make and the impact we have on the world. And so campaigns aim to change opinions and actions of our members, the public government or businesses. One of them is to strengthen certain values associated with certain goals or behaviour. So, in other words, if we want our students to vote, or if we want our students to volunteer, then one of the ways to do that is to actively strengthen values associated with those types of behaviour. Right. So, just a little bit more about how values work then. If we change our members' behaviour or attitudes by strengthening certain values, we have to understand how they work. So, values wheel was designed, which you can see there with lots of pretty colours. The values wheel was designed to support this understanding. So I'm just going to briefly go through each of the key features of values. So the first thing is that all values are universal, right? So what this means is that everyone holds all the values on the values wheel to differing extents, but people tend to place more importance on some values rather than others. So no one is like purely benevolent, like some level of achievement values, and equally like even those sort of egomaniacal, power-hungry person only have power values. They do have some or like universalism in them. Second thing is that we know that values are engaged, so our values aren't static. They can become temporarily engaged by external stimuli. So, for example, if we're at a music festival, we might act more hedonistically, or if we're reading the certain newspapers, that might increase certain levels of prejudice. Not naming any names, obviously. The third one is that the values spill over. So, on this values wheel, when a value is engaged, the values next to that on this wheel are engaged too. So, for example, if power values with a message of the importance about being wealthy, then it's also likely to strengthen the security values. So, in other words, it strengthens the values in sort of like areas of this wheel, right? Factor is the value seesaw. So, what I mean by this is when a value is engaged, it inhibits the opposing value on the values wheel. So, for example, if you're volunteering to run a nature walk for children, then not only will your intrinsic values, which are universalism and balance, the green ones at the top, be engaged, but also your extrinsic values, so the extent to which you value an achievement, will be suppressed. So that's why I use the word seesaw, because they inhibit the opposing value, the sort of values on the other side of the values wheel. And finally, values are strengthened. So in other words, a bit like muscles, repeated engagement, our values can be strengthened over time and become dominant. So for a lifetime of working in the military might expose someone to repeated experiences and messages that strengthen national security values to such an extent that those security values, which you can see in the blue, become very dominant about who they are as a person. Understandings are absolutely crucial to Kerr Darnton's critique of Oxfam and other large NGOs, because the goals of their campaigns are largely intrinsic, so they're all about global justice, equality, and solidarity. So all those goals are what we refer to as intrinsic goals, right? So associated with the sort of yellow, blue, green. However, the way that campaigns like Make Poverty History were conducted, which used celebrity, holding pop concerts, selling branded merchandise, and emphasising the need for fundraising, primarily engage extrinsic values, so they suppress the intrinsic values through that seesaw effect that the campaign was founded upon. The effect of this is to create a kind of values dissonance, where values that the campaign demands are in direct opposition to the means by which demands are made. Okay. So, American psychologist Kasser, who worked with Darnton on the report, produced a paper for Oxfam explaining this, warning them that every time a non-governmental organisation attempts to motivate change by appealing to individuals' self-interested concerns for money and status, businesses' desire to maximise profit, or to governments' felt mandate to increase economic growth, it subtly privileges and encourages the portion of people's value system that stand in opposition to positive social and ecological attitudes and behaviours. So, in other words, these organisations are strengthening the values associated with the type of goals that they want to achieve as an organisation. So, this diagram is used by the Public Institute who have helped develop and populate these sorts of understanding to discuss how to discuss sort of intrinsic and extrinsic action. So arguably, the development sector needed what it was to engage the common interest frames on the left, to allow a mass movement of people to come together to build a long-term transformational change by changing the power relations that create and recreate poverty. However, what happened too often was that, as Kasser outlined, they engaged self-interest values, which are on the right, to their members into kind of atomised, alienated financial supporters, and used the money to pay professionals to lobby for sort of more peaceful or incremental change. So, I hope to be clear. I'm now going to go on to talk about Okay, so is that the global justice movement derives its power from the same place as the unions do, which is sort of collectivism of organised people. This, if they fail to engage and organise their members, the movement has no power. Power means no ability to get things done, and no ability to get things done means no movement. So movement is an example that's quite helpful to consider. We said this, the economy is the method, but the object is to change the heart and the soul. It's about changing people's values using a form of economy. One on basically what I've just said as extrinsic sort of interested values. And to this assumption and project was not unfounded. So I don't know if this is too small for you to see, but there's research which shows that the more competitive the economy, the more the citizens of that country prioritise extrinsic values. So it is, to what extent is that within nations, the economy engages certain types of values. So it's to understand, therefore, how unions, which are organisations founded upon intrinsic values and the advancements of the common interest, were not compatible with Thatcher's vision of a sort of individualised competitive economy, right? However, the professor Hyman argues, as their membership of trade unions began to fall sharply in the mid-80s, many trade unions saw kind of new means of influence, and I think you'll see again some sort of parallels with student unions here. So one that Hyman talked about was a kind of new realism took hold at the base of trade unions, which is based on partnership with employers instead of opposition. So it kind of reinforced what Lenin and others referred to as a trade union consciousness, where rather than challenging it, trade unions attempted to merely improve like the material conditions of their workers' oppression rather than challenging the root cause of those things and the power relationships involved. This is so that trade unions have had it easy, obviously. The challenges to them are manifold, and unlike modern student unions, so like learning, production became internationalised, it became across multiple sites around the world, competition intensified across the sector as market became increasingly regulated, and just the idea of the normal student, the idea of the normal employment relationship sort of ceased to be, and the precarious job market increases the tendency of both workers as it does students to feel anxious about their financial security and individual employability. These challenges, Hyman argues that working for marginal adaptations to the dominant orthodoxy is the line of least resistance, and the realism and practicality of trade unionism that has lost its former utopian inspiration. So by swapping utopian inspiration for new realism and focusing on improving the material conditions of members' oppression rather than building a broad struggle for a more equal society, unions risk losing touch with founding values. For example, the messages that trade unions use to recruit new members now typically engage extrinsic values by appealing to self-interest. So let me give you an example. What you acquire by an unnamed trade union, which outlines 10 good reasons to join a union, right? And this doesn't necessarily single out this union because it's typical of many, and there are some exceptions. If you look at this, and again, I don't know how big it's coming up on your screen, but basically, the first out of the 10 good reasons, in inverted commas, presented to join this trade union are grounded purely in self-interest. So things like, you can earn more, you get a deal, you get more holiday, support need it, you're less likely to be injured. They're all about individual self-interest. It's like wishing to look at the use of the pronouns. It's all aimed at you, like literally everyone says you, which is the individual, rather than, it doesn't really talk about we as the collective. And it's not until the very end, it's not until you get to point 10, it just feels like an afterthought, that the union talks about the common interest, so fighting for a fairer society and making our country a better place. So this is what the Public Institute for Research Centre refer to as this values crash, or this sort of mental dissonance, whereby people's motivations are intrinsic and extrinsic messages are placed together and reduce each other's impact on our values. And we understand how this works because we understand how values work. And the adoption of this new realism also has profound implications for how trade unions are understood to act in society. So, if unions are understood to promote the self-interest of their individual members over the common interest of society, then public sector strikes are thought of as selfish or greedy, and you can see this in the press. An interest group acting irresponsibly at the public's expense. So when strikes in London, it's, I don't understand how terrible this is for all the commuters. And so under that understanding of the trade union, which rates in the self-interest of the individuals, belong to it rather than common interest of society, a union becomes another lobby group, sort of scrambling to assert their self-interest in the kind of me society. Okay, that's the second example from trade unions. How are we doing for time? 20 minutes, fine. So I'm going to bring it back to higher education, further education, and student unions. So the democratisation of the education sector, Thatcher and other architects of the neoliberal project have now successfully permeated universities and colleges with individualism, the logic of self-interest, and the values of the competitive economy. Sectors aren't necessarily happy about it. Certainly, vice chancellors up and down the country can be heard apologising for how very difficult but inevitable or realistic decisions that operate within this neoliberal orthodoxy to close courses with low demand or privatise services and cut staff benefits and wages. These are now the rules of the game, rules that would need to change for people to act differently within them. However, an optimistic view, and my view, is that students' unions have not yet followed these institutions all the way down this road into sort of pure individualism. Instead, they currently stand at a crossroads between new realism and idealism, between interest and self-interest, and between intrinsic and extrinsic values. If there's a waiting room, it's important that the student movement takes time to read and learn the numerous important lessons of the global justice and trade union movements, because as both of them, once the decision is made, it's really hard to go back. So the practical infrastructure alone is hard enough to reverse, let alone the less tangible but nevertheless pervasive organisational norms and common sense. However, student unions don't stand at this crossroads without some sort of history of their own. After the ideological assault on the trade union movement the decade before, John Major's speech to the Conservative Party in 1992 made it clear that students' unions were the next target, saying that we've already blown the whistle on the last bastions of the closed shop. And students' unions, days in which they march and demonstrate at the taxpayers' expense, are numbered. Although not successful in making students' unions membership voluntary, the limitations of the legal purpose through various bits of regulation, including the Charities Act and the 94 Act, were an to cement self-interest at the heart of students' unions. Makes it relatively clear which path would be least resistance for the student movement, and it would be easy to follow the path of the development sector as unions that of the trade union movement. The extent to which our history affects our ability to even comprehend that we have a choice should not be underestimated. Okay, this diagram was produced by the Deputy of Guildford, Alex Bowles, who produced this matrix, means of exploring how student unions could develop in the future. Bowles himself, I should say, did say that this matrix was quite crude. Nevertheless, it's quite a useful starting point for the discussion. So along the bottom y-axis is the focus that students' unions place on different activities, from presentation at one end to commercial activities at the other, and then on the x-axis, we're changing relationship of students with their institution and unions. With the students as partners or consumers, and use the resulting quadrants to create some sort of broad typologies of students' unions. The focus that the 94 Act placed on representation and the depoliticisation of charity registration went some way to creating the idea that students' unions are without ideology. It's appropriate, therefore, that politics present sort of pre-consideration of values. However, in the light of Hyman's critique of trade unions and the transition to nihilism and partnership, perhaps the right quartile is not quite so ideal as it might immediately appear, as if this means students' unions adopting to an equivalent student union consciousness, whereby they become partners with the university's values and the sort of neoliberal orthodoxy. However, matrix may be useful to consider alongside a different matrix, which is this one. As such matrices is often to simplify the argument. This matrix is arguably equally crude, if not more so. However, it does allow us to consider values and the sort of questions that the students' unions face and the related goals and motivations. In this matrix, along the y-axis is the students' union focus, if you like. So, are they acting in the self-interest of the individual members? That's on the left-hand side, or interests of society, which obviously includes students. At the axis is the role of students in delivering this work, from passive alienation at the bottom to deep engagement at the top. Unions operate a bit like NGOs and charities that Kirk and Darnton identified. So they have a kind of mile-wide and inch-deep approach to membership engagement. Although these organisations do operate in the common interest and have intrinsic goals, they often engage extrinsic values to fund the kind of professional protest model, which acts to alienate the membership. So change is delivered by a sort of small and elite group. In the bottom left of this Values Crossroads, unions act to ensure a return on the individual members' sort of investment in the quality of their student experience. So they have a strong emphasis on customer service and employability, and representation is a function of kind of quality assurance rather than inclusiveness or democracy. However, unconsciously, individualism is still the name of the game. So students' unions work for, not with, their students to kind of champion their consumer rights. Left segment, unions operate more like the trade unions that Simon identified, who engage their members in improving the sort of material conditions of their experience in partnership with the institution. So members are engaged, decisions are made on the basis of kind of aggregated self-interest within orthodox understanding of education as a privilege which functions to increase the value of an individual's labour within a job market, the extent to which you'll be able to get a high-paid job. In the top right segment, student unions act like social movements, so make collective challenges to elites, people by students with common purposes and solidarity in sustained interactions. It is students' unions challenge the neoliberal logic, individualism, using participative democracy to identify the common interest and the collective power of the members to achieve it. Bowls, for example, when a students' union from the top right segment acts in the bottom left segment, they operate a kind of consumer cooperative, provided that students and other local citizens need stop using collective buying power and run by students for the good of the students and wider society. So simple as saying, do we have commercials or do we focus on representation? It's about motivation and about the goals that those activities, whether it's selling things or representing things, are there to deliver. I hope that makes sense. However, when a student union from the bottom right segment of one acts in the same segment on the other, they're run by professionals operating like a sort of commercial supermarket, giving students no control beyond their individual consumer choices, which are themselves shaped by sort of advertising, loss leaders, and other kind of standard sort of commercial techniques. By way of conclusion, sort of remove the money from the sector. Universities and colleges now operate within a kind of competitive economy on a neoliberal logic of self-interest. And psychological research shows competitive and deregulated economies, as we saw with the slide showing different economies and different values, and stronger extrinsic values, which are understood to underpin antisocial behaviour, anxiety, prejudice, and low levels of empathy and political engagement. So in other words, the message is that university students and staff are exposed to in this environment are likely to strengthen extrinsic values, which is associated selfishness, cheating, dishonesty, not sort of behaviours that students are trying to contrast. Student unions, and in fact unions in general, are founded upon collectivism, the common interest, sharing and equality. So deriving it from money, a union's power is derived from people. Unions express this power by its members working together to agitate in the common interest. College student where shows the value associated with this sort of behaviour, whether it's cooperation, political engagement and volunteering, are intrinsic values. So understanding how values work helps us recognise that if staff and students' extrinsic values are being engaged and strengthened by a competitive environment, these intrinsic values are being suppressed. In this space, students' unions stand at the values crossroads, which you see here. In which way to turn, they can learn valuable lessons from the trade union movement and development sector. If they operate in the exclusive self-interest of students, then it's being perceived both by the members and wider society as another kind of private lobby group interested only in the furtherance of their privileged members. If they use messages that strengthen and engage extrinsic values, they risk suppressing the values associated with the collective action. This is crucial as unions are founded upon the recognition of the power of working together. If a wide and inch-deep approach to membership engagement, keep their members at arm's length and trying to deliver change professionally for and not with the membership, then risk failing to mobilise their members to create real transformational change. Most of all, they don't recognise that they have a choice if they accept that the neoliberal orthodoxy of the sector and operate within it under a kind of new realism to try to get the best students. They're being replaced wholesale by student service centres, as we've seen, as without ideology and without independence and without politics and without values, what is the difference between a students' union and the university or college department? It's a student union without unity and values. Okay, so I'll stop talking. You'll be now. I've gone through a lot there in half an hour, but I hope it was helpful. I wondered if people have any questions. I think you have to type them, and I'll do my best to answer them. Or challenges that they want to make, or so I've had a few come through. So will be available in the future. Okay, so you go on to the and there's on NUS Connect there's a resources section, and in there there's this paper basically which you can download, and there's an executive summary, and there's like a full version which is more like what I've just did. So yeah, I think if you just Google Values Crossroads NUS Connect, you'll come to it. Okay, so I said, can you provide details of the King's College research? I can't, because it's sort of private, belongs to them. But essentially what the did as a method was that as part of the Students' Union's annual 4-year strategic planning process, then we use Schwartz's values methodology, basically. So we took a kind of shorthand for member students' values of that, and because lots of other questions in that, we could look at how we could then look at that data and look at how different values are correlated with different types of behaviour. A lot of information on this sort of stuff, but probably easiest to access a lot of it is via a group called Common Cause. Again, if you just Google Common Cause or values and frames, and then that lot of research which looks at the relationship between and framed people's values. Yeah, and then another thing is, where do you think the majority of students' unions are going towards intrinsic or extrinsic values? So my honest answer is that I think that students or intrinsic values, but they behave in that way, and they'll use a lot of skill and engage extrinsic values when they're trying to get students to do things. Ultimately, relates to a very common thing, which is that people think that they have good values, but that everyone else is selfish and evil. And I'm exaggerating slightly for effect, but there is research suggests that people think, well, I'm a good person, but everyone else is selfish. There's an extent to which I think this happens in students' unions, whereby we think, oh, well, students will only do this if we say to them that it will look on their CV and help their future employment, or students will only do this if we pay them. All those things ultimately reinforce extrinsic values. There's another academic, Michael Sander, who wrote that book, What Money Can't Buy, which is worth a look as well. And he was quite a lot about how by appealing to market, so extrinsic values, what it does kind of crowds out the space for other motivations. So I'll give you money if you do it, or it'll be good for you and it'll make you more money or give you higher status. Then it stops people from having base almost to find more moral or ethical motivations to do things. So that's a very long way of saying, Tom, that I think that at their heart, unions are intrinsic, but because of the increasingly extrinsic environment that they're in, where you have a very highly marketized sector, they are increasingly operating more in that way. Basically, what do you think? More extrinsically or intrinsically, or? And do you have any evidence research showing that you can, have me reading this out, that you can just get any people engaged by intrinsic values than extrinsic ones, or is it just related to what you're saying about not assuming that people are worse than you? Okay, yeah. So there's quite a lot of evidence to show that if you engage people in things which are associated with sort of intrinsic outcomes, extrinsic motivators, and the outcomes are different. So, for example, one study showed that when an environmental group was to get people to their homes, in order, the motion for the environment group doing that was to reduce CO2 emissions. The way that they tried to get people to do it was by saying, if you in your home, you'll save money because bills will be lower. And what they found was that as insulated, all the homes were still using about the same amount of energy. And into it, basically people were just inside, basically. So people, because the association with doing it were to the to actually caring about the environment, basically. So and that, I guess, would play out in terms of thinking about recruiting course reps or something like that. That you might be able to recruit using extrinsic motivations. Say it's good on their CV, but then how do they actually behave when they're in that space? You know, do they go on consult with other students? Are they empathic? Motivated to do this job to achieve that you want it to? So it's how it's about outcome in many cases. Okay, I think they're acting more extrinsic. However, I don't think all is lost yet. Just need the consumer mentality of HE that is over. Could be more, Tom. That's sort of why I put out there, really. Try to get people to realise that I think we are at a crossroads whereby if you look at the logic that underpins whether something is a good decision or a bad decision on campus, increasingly one major factors, if not the factor in that, is to do with money and status, and the production of knowledge or creativity or integrity or empathy or love or collectivity or equality, right? And if you look at us and your trade union and you look at the management and you look at the staff and you look at the students, I think that ultimately more intrinsic sort of sessions and interventions would be the student union, because they're organisations which are fundamentally founded on collectivism and intrinsic value. It's just that we're getting taken over by other motivations which surround us. Okay, so Tom, the NUS Officer Development Programme could play an active role in enforcing intrinsic values and developing officer capacity to build them. Yeah, couldn't more. And I always do some workshop related to values for that reason. Says we that a good place to start would be to increase the intrinsic motivation within the organisations with staff, more humanistic leadership management, e.g., creating a relation, introducing coaching, mentoring, moving away from the behavioural ball. Yeah, so yes is the answer. That values. One thing values, right, is that it joins together lots of different issues, because our values, if you think about the way that different organisations that try and do good in the world operate, we go, right, so human rights are important, poverty problem, climate change definitely, could wipe out the human race. Education is helpful for social mobility and equality and wisdom. And so the thing is that all the organisations look on this, do it separately, look at these issues in a joined up way, understanding that actually a lot of it, there's a kind of we know, but there is a kind of common motivation, and that they're the more sort of intrinsic values, basically. And so I think that in order to intrinsically, we have to treat each other intrinsically, because it is about a set of social relations, and so an organ is sort of hierarchical, very dominant, and where the social relations aren't based on trust, is not going to sort of reinforce those kind of values in other people, basically. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Juliet. When you're on NUS Connect, if you haven't seen it already, there's also another paper which relates to a lot of this stuff. A new one sense on campus, which addresses sort of similar issues, which you might want to look at as well if you do down the kind of paper version of this session. Plug. Cool. One of your specific points, Juliet, about introducing organisation. In all the organisations I've worked in the last 10 years, I've run read days, which is then all my team will get together and we can read anything we want, basically all day. And you have a read in the morning, you discuss what you've read and how it relates to your work. And then in the afternoon, you do the same. You have another set of reading, and then normally, if I'm completely honest, and like about again what you've read and how you're going to apply it to your work. And actually, like a lot of this, if I'm totally just came out of information in this presentation came out of me having to read about this kind of stuff and look at organisations and their experiences. And I think I do have to take time to learn and sort of enhance and sort of broaden where we get information from. And that is an intrinsic value. So valuing that will increase people's empathy and the other associated with. So. Any questions or thoughts? Okay. Cool, thanks, Emily. Yeah, the learning sounds amazing. Cool. Tom says that intrinsic values at Bath Uni. Yes. If you're interested in doing more work around this, then do give me a shout. There's a project that I'm doing with 5 unions over the next few months, called the Free Inquiry, which is looking specifically at what values unions engage through their communications on key issues. We will be able to do a report back at SU 15 on that as a couple, basically. And one of the things that we're also going to do is look at developing ways of framing some union activities that engage intrinsic values more explicitly. So it's a kind of engagement stroke communications. So yeah, look out for that as well. Cool. All right. Unless there's any strong objections, I'm going to leave it there. But thank you very much for joining me. And yeah, good luck making everything intrinsic. Cheers. Catch you soon, Juliet. Bye.